Thank you, Margie. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming out on this terrible Sunday, weather-wise. When I looked out this morning, I did kind of grimace a bit, but thank you all for being here. As Margie said, I have written 13 books with Second Story Press and a total of 20, I think this is my 23rd book, most of which, except for one, really most of which focus on stories of the Second World War and the Holocaust. You can see just a few of my books on the screen behind me. I'm very proud of the writing that I do. I'm very passionate about the writing that I do. I am the child of Holocaust survivors, so this writing certainly does come from a deeply personal place for me, starting with the stories of my parents, but also the stories of other relatives, the community of survivors that I grew up in. And I'm so pleased to be able to talk about this book today, To Look a Nazi in the Eye. So just in terms of how we're going to proceed for the next hour or so, I will start off by giving you the background to this story, the trial that took place in Germany, what it was all about, why it was so important. Then I will introduce Jordana to speak about her experience of being an observer at this trial, the journey that she undertook, which is truly remarkable, as you will hear. And then, of course, we are honored to be joined by three of the survivors that we write about in the book, Hetty Baum, Max Eisen, and Bill Gleed, and I will introduce each of them in turn. And they will also speak about what it meant for them to be witnesses at this trial, why that was important for them to make this journey and to be there to talk about their stories. So, To Look a Nazi in the Eye, for those of you who don't know, focuses on the trial of a man by the name of Oskar Grünig. Oskar Grünig was known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz. That's a picture of him on the left, at about the time that he volunteered for the SS. He was an SS guard in Auschwitz. And as this title, bookkeeper of Auschwitz, he was responsible for going through the belongings of Jews that were arriving in Auschwitz. So they were disembarking from the cattle cars onto this infamous ramp. You can see a picture of it on the right. By the thousands, the ramp was really just a long platform. The train would roll into Auschwitz, they would disembark. And Grünig was responsible for going through their belongings on the platform, rifling through their belongings, and collecting gold and valuables and whatever things of value that he could find, and presumably sending those valuables to Berlin to bolster the coffers of the Third Reich. And then his job was to clear the platform of luggage and valuables and belongings that had been left behind, so that the next transport of Jews who would arrive on the ramp and disembark, there would be no evidence of what was to become of them. Of course, on the ramp is where the infamous selection took place, where Jews were either immediately sent to the gas chamber or were granted life for a little bit longer. Who knew how much longer? So he would clear the ramp so that the next arrival would not have any idea of what was going to happen. So this trial in Germany focused on a period of time from May to July 1944, really near the end of the Second World War, during what became known as Operation Hungary. So in that brief amount of time, May to July 1944, really only 10 weeks, there were approximately 425,000 Hungarian Jews who were sent to Auschwitz. And of that number, 300,000 were immediately sent to the gas chamber. It's really a stunning number. And Oskar Grünig was being charged with being complicit, being an accomplice to, being part of the murder of those 300,000 Jews. So that's really what the trial is all about. The lawyer who was prosecuting this trial, working for the survivors who were coming to testify, is a man by the name of Thomas Walter. That's a picture of Thomas on the left. He's an attorney, a retired judge, and he has been working since his retirement to investigate Nazi war crimes in Germany. He's been doing this for years. He's not Jewish, but he has taken it upon himself to investigate war crimes of Nazi war criminals. And he really spearmarked a landmark legal decision that was really the turning point in allowing someone like Oskar Brüning to be brought to trial. So it's really important to understand how that landmark decision came down. And this is really, in a nutshell, what it involved. After the war, there existed on the books in Germany basically a law that said you could not be tried for having been part of a place like Auschwitz unless it could be proved that you were directly responsible for the death of an individual. So unless it could be proved that you shot someone or pulled the hangman's lever or dropped the pellets of gas, you would not be held responsible for any role that you played in Auschwitz. So as a result of that, let's say there were approximately 6,000 to 8,000 SS who worked in Auschwitz over the course of the war. Only 43 were ever brought to trial. Only 9 received sentences. And the rest basically went home at the end of the war and never faced the court system. All of that changed in 2011 in a case that Thomas Walter was involved in. And that was the prosecution of a man by the name of John Demjanjuk. He was known as Ivan the Terrible. And he was convicted in 2011 with Thomas Walter working on the case. He was convicted of being an accessory to the murder of 28,000 Dutch Jews in the concentration camp Sobibor. Now, Ivan the Terrible had never killed anyone directly in Sobibor, but the decision in that trial basically stated that anyone who was part of the Nazi machine, anyone who was working in one of those camps, no matter what their role, was as guilty as those who were directly responsible for the death of an individual. And that was really a precedent-setting decision. And it paved the way for other Nazi war criminals to be brought to trial. But now we were in 2012, 13, 14, 15, so many years after the war. What would be the big problem facing the prosecution of Nazi war criminals today? They're not alive. There are none of them left. Most of them have died. The ones that remain are old, many of them sick, many of them unfit to stand trial. So that is a huge problem, obviously still today. Nevertheless, it was that decision in that trial in 2011 that really paved the way for Thomas to seek out Oskar Brüning and bring him to trial. And so on the right, you can actually see the courtroom in Lüneburg, Germany, where this trial took place. On the right of the trial room is Oskar Brüning with his lawyers. On the far left is Thomas Walter with the survivors, the panel of judges in the front. So Thomas came to Toronto to find Holocaust survivors who had survived in Auschwitz, having lost many, most, all of their family members there, looking for those who would be willing to travel to Germany to testify in this trial about their experience in Auschwitz. And he was particularly interested in having the survivors testify about their arrival on the infamous ramp in Auschwitz. And he found 3 survivors here in Toronto. And we write about all 3 of them in the book. So in no order, I will just tell you in a nutshell about the 3 survivors who came, and I will introduce them more fully in a moment. But their stories are all chilling, and they have courageously, over the years, used their voices to talk about their experiences, and they continue to use their voices to talk about their experiences during that time. In total, there were approximately 70 survivors who traveled from around the world to Germany to testify at this trial, from Israel, Australia, the UK, across the United States, across Europe, all placing themselves on the ramp at the time of Operation Hungary. It was not necessary for them to identify Brüning directly. What they needed to testify about was the events that happened on the ramp with their families when they arrived, and if they could place themselves on the ramp at the same time that Brüning was on the ramp, verifying the experiences of what had gone on there. So Hetty Baum, who you see on the left of this slide, was one of the first survivors that Thomas interviewed here in Toronto and convinced to go to Germany. Jordana actually knew Hetty before this experience, having met her on the March of the Living when Jordana was only 16. You can see the effect that the March of the Living had on Jordana, the slide on the right. So I'm not going to talk about the survival stories of the survivors who are here. We write about them extensively in the book, and certainly I could do no justice speaking about them in just that thumbnail. Hetty was 16 when she was sent to Auschwitz. She was the only one of her family, immediate family, to survive under quite brutal conditions. The other survivors were Bill Gleed and Max Eisen, also here today. And I actually knew both of them before this trial took place, before we wrote this book. I actually wrote about a short story about Bill's sister some years ago for a collection of short stories that I'd written. Bill was 13 when he was sent on the transport to Auschwitz with his family members. And Max was also a young teenager when he was sent to Auschwitz with his large family. He was the only one to survive. And his story, like the others, is painful. These are all stories of separation and loss. And I've known Max for years. We've spoken on some panels together. I've been a great admirer of his, certainly, for many years. And the other reason that I knew both of these gentlemen is that they were actually on the March of the Living that I participated in 2 years ago. So I finally went on March of the Living 2 years ago as an adult, as a participant. And this is the photograph of the group of survivors that accompanied my group just before we were embarking on the march. We're in front of the adult contingent. And on the far left of this slide is Max and Bill and the other survivors. So these were the three from Toronto that accompanied Thomas Walter to Germany for this trial. So you have to know that the trial of Oskar Gröning was worldwide news. Raise your hand, actually, if you had ever heard of this trial before today or before knowing about this book. So many of you, of course, were following it in the way that I was following this story as well. In all the media, print, news, television, radio. And I wanted to write about this trial from the time that I read about it, but I struggled with how to do that for the primarily young audience that I'm accustomed to writing for, the young adult audience that I'm accustomed to writing for. So this book certainly is a book that will be read by adults, but I also wanted this book to be read by high school students and college students. You know, Margie talked about that generation making a meaningful connection to this history, and that's always my goal in writing, is attracting a young audience to this history so that they can make that connection. And I was struggling about how to write about this trial for that young adult audience. And then I read an article in the Canadian Jewish News that maybe some of you read as well, about a young woman named Jordana Leibowitz. And I was thoroughly inspired by this article. And what the article talked about was the fact that at the young age of 19, Jordana, on her own, had decided that she wanted to go to Germany so that she could be a witness at the trial of Oskar Gröning. And what I thought about Jordana, what this article had said, was that she had been inspired by her own experience of being on the March of the Living at the age of 16. And it was that journey. You know, I think that at 16, there are many kids who are moved by March of the Living. There are some who perhaps are not moved by it. Jordana was tremendously moved by it. As you can, I'll show you some of the photographs from Jordana's March of the Living. I think it was just a constant experience of being moved by this history. Jordana standing in what was one of the gas chambers with Hetty, who was a tremendous source of inspiration for her throughout that journey, and listening to one of the survivors speak. It was actually Hetty that told Jordana that this trial was taking place in Germany, and Hetty was the one who created that light bulb moment, I think, for Jordana to create the opportunity to go and be there at this trial. I really think that starting from the age of 16, Jordana was on a journey as a young activist, learning as much about this history as she could. She is the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, bearing witness to this history, and finding a way, most importantly, to be a spokesperson for this history for her generation. Who better to talk to young people about this history than young people? So I contacted Jordana. Facebook is a wonderful thing. And I simply, cold messaged her on Facebook. And we began to meet on a regular basis, probably weekly basis, hundreds of times, so that I could really gather all of the information about this story through the eyes of this young person, this young witness. And like many of you who have met Jordana, I was certainly inspired by her. She is one of these driven, fearless, passionate women. So in the book, we write about how she managed to get to Germany on her own. That is a story in and of itself. How she managed to get into the courtroom on a regular basis. People lined up from the crack of dawn for the few seats that were available inside the courtroom. Jordana had a pass to get in on a daily basis. She actually spoke with the judge in court one day. My husband is a lawyer. He said no one ever speaks to a judge in the course of a trial, but Jordana walked up to the judge and spoke to him, questioned him about the trial. That too is remarkable. She certainly became even closer to the survivors than she had been before, inspired by their stories, by their history, by their courage. She blogged about all of these experiences for the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal. Her blogs are included in the book. And her perspective, that young person's perspective, was just what I was looking for to be a spokesperson for this story. So I'm not going to say much more about the details of this book. They really speak for themselves within the book. But I just want to tell you something about the conclusion of the trial, since that is no secret. So just to remind you, this is what Oskar Grünig looked like when he joined the SS and became a guard in Auschwitz. And this is what Oskar Grünig looked like when he entered the courtroom on day one of the trial. 94 years old, frail, bent over, leaning on a walker, aided by attendants. He was convicted of being complicit in the murder of 300,000 Jews in Auschwitz, in a trial that lasted for 3 months. Jordana was there for the first week, 10 days of that trial. And he was sentenced to 4 years. So the verdict was appealed and held up on appeal. And recently, no one ever assumed that he would go to prison. Recently, there was a newspaper article just a couple of months ago, I don't know if you saw it, that basically said that he is fit to go to prison. Although again, I doubt that he will, in all honesty. I don't think it will happen. And the truth is, no one is looking for a jail term for Oskar Grünig, including, if I can speak for them, including the survivors themselves. What they wanted and what they got was a statement on record that Auschwitz was a killing factory whose primary product was the murder of Jews. And everyone who worked in that factory, including people like Oskar Grünig, who had never killed anyone directly, was responsible for that product. And that's basically what the verdict in this trial said. I'm going to quote Bill. All the survivors have been interviewed numerous times about their experience of being part of this trial, and many of them have beautiful quotes. This one stood out for me, and I really think it summarizes what this verdict was all about. Bill said, Oskar Grünig was a cog in the wheel, but that wheel could not have turned without that cog. So everyone who worked in Auschwitz, no matter what your role, was responsible. So there are just a few other points that I want you to think about before I ask Jordana to come up. Important considerations when we think about this trial or others like it. The first is this. Oskar Grünig apologized in court for his actions. This is what he said. He said, "There is no question that I am morally guilty for my role in the process. Before the victims, I also admit to this moral guilt here, with regret and humility. No one should have taken part in Auschwitz. I know that. I sincerely regret not having lived up to this realization earlier and more consistently. I am very sorry. So he apologized for, but if you listen to the wording, he apologized for his moral responsibility in Auschwitz. The second thing to consider, while he admitted moral responsibility for his actions, he denied any legal guilt arising from anything that he had done in Auschwitz. Remember, he had not killed anyone directly, and that was largely the defense that was launched by his lawyers. So he acknowledged moral responsibility, but maintained that legally he was not guilty. Third thing to think about. Oskar Grüning volunteered for the Waffen-SS, the elite armed wing of the Nazi Party, and said from the very beginning that he was drawn to the elegance of the uniform and believed strongly that Jews were the enemy of Germany. He said, "If you are convinced that the eradication of Jews is necessary, then it no longer matters how the killing takes place. At the time, I believed that what I was doing was right." He volunteered, believed that Jews were the enemy of Germany, apologized for his actions, admitted no legal responsibility. The fourth thing to think about. Think about his age at the time of the trial. 94, old, frail. And there are some people who have maintained that the man you punish at 94 is not the man who committed the crime. And I ask you, is there or should there be a statute of limitations on crimes that were committed so many years earlier? And is there ever a statute of limitations on genocide? Think about that. And finally, is a sentence of 4 years enough for a crime of this magnitude? And is there any sentence that can compensate for the murder of 300,000? Think about that. These are all questions and issues that Jordana grappled with while she was on her journey to be an observer at this precedent-setting trial, trying to understand the events of history and trying to understand how she could be a spokesperson for this history for her generation. And so with that statement, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce I think someone who's become my dear friend. I really do adore this young woman. Please welcome Jordana Liebowitz.